This session is on modern tyranny, now that we've sorted out ancient tyranny, which left me as confused as I was before the session. We'll perhaps clarify modern tyranny. If anyone can do it, these two gentlemen can. João Espada, who is among many things, I've been told the person responsible for resurrecting intellectual life in Portugal, which I suppose isn't something you'd say about yourself, but it's something people say about you. Founder of the Institute for Political Studies at Catholic University, Portugal. Most recently, the holder of the European Parliament Brownislaw Garamek European Civilization Chair at the College of Europe. Author of many books, one very well known to English speakers called Social Citizen Rights, a critique of Hayek and Raymond Platt. He's taught at many places all around the world, including in the United States, Brown, Stanford, Georgetown, and is also a publicly engaged intellectual who's been an advisor to Portuguese presidents and not just a critique or a critic or a theorizer, but also a contributor to democratic politics. Also, Paul Ray, author of the very recently released, I think, Montesquieu and the Logic of Liberty, and just a couple years ago, a book that's on my shelf, Soft Democracy and Democracy's Drift, and also Against Throne and Altar, Machiavelli and Political Theory under the English Republic. Another book, a magisterial book, that is on everyone's bookshelves. It's a real beast of a book. It's about 1,000 pages. I've read every one of them, Paul. Don't you worry.
You're the only one.
Republics, Ancient and Modern, Classical Republicanism and the American Revolution. I might note that Professor Ray's presence at the University of Tulsa for 25 years with Michael Mosher made that institution famous in the Anglo-American world of political theory. Today, now teaching at Hillsdale. So we are delighted and honored to have you both here. Thank you. Why don't we start with you, Professor Espada, if that's okay. We can start either way. But
as you wish.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that very extremely too kind introduction. And I also would like to thank our hosts here today, Professors James Murphy and Robert Paquette, for having invited me to this most inspiring conference and this most inspiring college. It's actually my first time at Dartmouth College, and I'm delighted to be here today. A word of thanks, too, to the sponsors of this program. It is for me a great pleasure and honor to be here today. So going straight to my paper, I think I'd like to start by saying that my main contention in this presentation today is that a common feature of modern tyrannies has been the promise or the ambition of a final model of perfection, of a perfect society. This longing for perfection has been accompanied by the contempt for the imperfection of the modest concept of democracy, the modest concept of democracy that I will be defending here today. And this modest concept of democracy requires from democracy only the ability to allow change without bloodshed. So it's not virtuous democracy, but it's only liberal or limited democracy. I will develop this main contention in 3 stages. In the first stage, I will argue that in the modern era, certainly since the French Revolution of 1789, that infectious disease, as Edmund Burke put it, This longing for perfection has been mainly associated with the longing for equality. Tocqueville, I think, still remains today the best observer and analyst of this quest for equality and its totalitarian threat. In the first section of my paper, I will briefly recall some of Tocqueville's well-known insights on how the era of equality can bring about a new form of despotism, and how only liberty can gently tame the passion for equality. This taming of equality through liberty has been achieved mainly in America and the Anglo-American world, as contrasted with France, still according to Tocqueville, with whom I happen to agree. In the second stage of my argument, I will briefly compare, still following Tocqueville, two different roads into the modern era of democracy and equality. The one followed by America and the English-speaking peoples on the one hand, and the one followed by France and, well, broadly speaking, the European continent on the other. My main contention at this point will be that democracy has had two different meanings in these two different historical traditions. In continental Europe, democracy has been mainly understood as the unlimited government of the people, or in the name of the people, actually, whereas in the Anglo-American tradition, it has mainly meant a further limit on government. Democracy as a further limit on government. In other words, in the Anglo-American tradition, democracy has been understood as a complex balance between two principles: constitutionalism, or government limited by law, and representative government, or government limited and accountable to parliament. Recalling the works of several 20th century political philosophers of liberty, such as Karl Popper, Friedrich Hayek, Isaiah Berlin, and Michael Oakeshott, I will then argue that in the 20th century, this balance between constitutional and representative government has mainly been broken in the name of the will of the people, against constitutional limits on every will, including the will of the people. This has been, in my view, the main source of tyranny in the 20th century. In the third section, though, I will present a somewhat paradoxical contention. I will argue that this complex balance between constitutional and parliamentary government can also be broken from the side of too much constitutional constraint. This was certainly the case of Portugal, my home country, after the democratic revolution of 1974, when a sort of socialist constitution tried to limit the choices of future parliamentary elections by imposing a fixed blueprint of a socialist society, rather than just limiting itself to establishing the rules of the democratic game. So this was the Portuguese case, which I'm just mentioning. But also, this was the warning coming from Ralph Dahrendorf in 1990, a German-British scholar, shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when he advised Central and Eastern European democrats not to confuse liberal democracy with another fixed blueprint of a sort of pure capitalism, of a sort of final society to be achieved. In the final part of this section, I will then argue that Dahrendorf's warnings should be taken seriously in Europe today, even within the European Union, where a dogmatic interpretation of the European project as an ever closer union, or more Europe, that's the traditional expression nowadays, is being constitutionalized. I can't develop this much, but I will just mention. So finally, I will conclude by saying that modern liberty rests and has rested on a complex balance between two principles: constitutional government and government accountable to parliament. Tyranny can occur whenever this balance is broken, or as Edmund Burke would have put it, when the equipoise of the vessel of liberal democracy may be endangered by overloading it on one side, upon one side. I will then submit that this overloading upon one side, be it the side of constitutionalism or the side of the will of the people, is mainly associated with the promise or the ambition of a final model of perfection, of a perfect society. In order to avoid tyranny, we should therefore refuse politics of perfection, and we should prefer politics of imperfection. So this is mainly the argument I'd like to present here today. Let us then start with Tocqueville, the era of equality and the threat of a tyranny of the majority. The democratic age, Tocqueville wrote in 1835, is the future of the Western Christian societies. In no country other than America did democracy reveal itself in all its splendor. Throughout democracy in America, Tocqueville describes in detail the multiple manifestations of the era of equality. And after observing these manifestations carefully, he concludes that the era of equality creates two trends, which apparently contradict each other, but which, on final analysis, end up feeding each other. The first is of an individualistic nature and overthrows all the authority external to each individual. The individual of the democratic era, while considering all others as equals, does not recognize in any other individual or in any other entity, unless consented by him, any legitimacy as a source of authority. That is the first trend. But there is a second trend in the democratic era, which conducts man, quote, by a longer, more secret, but more certain road to servitude, end quote. This is the tendency towards centralization and standardization, the tendency towards the reinforcement of central political power, and towards the unlimited expansion of the sphere and intervention of political power. What Tocqueville observes is that the same tendency, drawing the democratic man not to recognize any authority outside himself, also draws him to confer unlimited authority to the central government, as long as this is exercised in the name of all and in the name of equality. The result will be a new, previously unknown form of despotism. And I have this very classical quote from Tocqueville that you all know, but still I will read parts of it. So I quote from Tocqueville, Democracies in America. The first thing that strikes the observation is an innumerable multitude of men, all equals and alike, incessantly endeavoring to procure the petty and paltry pleasures with which they glut their lives. Above this race of men stands an immense and tutelary power, which takes upon itself alone to secure their gratifications and to watch over their fate. That power is absolute, minute, regular, provident, and mild. It would be like the authority of a parent if, like that authority, its object was to prepare man for manhood. But it seeks, on the contrary, to keep them in perpetual childhood. It is well content that the people should rejoice, provided they think of nothing but rejoicing. For their happiness, such a government willingly labors, but it chooses to be the sole agent and the only arbiter of that happiness. It provides for their security, foresees and supplies their necessities, facilitates their pleasures, manages their principal concerns, directs their industry, regulates the descent of property, and subdivides their inheritances. What remains but to spare them all the care of thinking and all the trouble of living? The principle of equality has prepared man for these things. It has predisposed man to endure them and oftentimes to look on them as benefits. End quote, excuse me. Readers of Tocqueville who have been introduced to the concept of democracy by the cultural tradition of continental enlightenment have often been surprised at this point. That tradition of the continental Enlightenment and continental European tradition teaches that democracy lies in the sovereignty of the people's general will, a famous expression from Rousseau, and that its emergence resulted from a break with medieval tradition, a break established by the famous or infamous French Revolution. Now, Tocqueville, who praises democracy, who was a Democrat, is criticizing the unlimited sovereignty of the general will and praising the medieval and aristocratic pluralistic tradition. How is this possible? Well, yes, so this is my question. How is it possible? And this question leads me to the second stage of my argument, the difference between the Anglo-American and the continental European understanding of democracy. It is widely believed in continental Europe that the main distinction between liberal democracy and authoritarian regimes lies in the acceptance or rejection of government of the people or of majority rule, also known as popular sovereignty. What is curious, though, is that none of the main political philosophers who in the 20th century have defended liberal democracy, who have opposed both national socialist and communist regimes, none of them defended the principle of popular sovereignty, and almost all were expressly or openly critical of it, or skeptical. And yet, at the same time, they all defended liberal democracy. Karl Popper, for instance, seriously condemned the vanguardist doctrines of Plato and Marx, according to which the best regime should be determined by a government or of a group of specialists, the philosophers in Plato and the leaders of the proletariat in Marx. But Karl Popper also was explicitly concerned with emphasizing that the alternative to this view of government of Plato and Marx was not simply the government by the people. His now famous theory of democracy is based precisely on the assertion that the question who should rule must not be seen as the crucial question that defines the best political regime. Popper argued that this question should actually be replaced by another completely different question, namely how to get rid of bad governments without bloodshed or violence. In seeking to answer this question, Popper showed that a majority rule was not sufficient by itself. Majority rule also had to be limited by a set of rules that would prevent it from turning into a dictatorship. Friedrich Hayek dedicated a great part of his work to this exact same problem and was concerned to record the long process of limiting government that gradually led to the rise of modern liberal democracies, particularly in English-speaking countries. Isaiah Berlin underlined the importance of distinguishing between liberty and sovereignty, negative and positive liberty on the political realm. And he held the confusion of the two responsible for being at the root of the worst kinds of tyrannies. Michael Oakeshott highlighted the rule of law as one of the main distinctive features of Western civilization. The issue of limited government, in my view, clearly distinguishes the nature of the English Revolution of 1688 and the American Revolution of 1776 on the one hand, from the French Revolution of 1789 on the other. At a strict theoretical level, the issue of limited government was already present in the English Magna Carta of 1215 and was central in John Locke, David Hume, Edmund Burke, and the Federalist Papers, which prepared, as we know, the American Constitution. And by contrast, this concept of limited government was absolutely and expressly absent from the thinking of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the author who most influenced the French Revolution and the Jacobins in particular, and, in my view, who most influenced their intellectual heritage until the emergence of Marxism, which, in my view, is in Rousseau's that in almost every way. Now, let me now move to the third and final stage of my argument. I have been arguing so far that this balance between constitutional and representative government was broken in the 20th century, mainly in the name of the will of the people against constitutional limits on every will, including the will of the people. But I would like to add now, and this may seem somewhat paradoxical, and it might be actually a bit, that the complex balance between constitutional and parliamentary government can also be broken from the side of too much constitutional constraints. As I mentioned before, this was certainly the case of Portugal after the Democratic Revolution of 1974, when a sort of socialist constitution tried to limit the choices of future parliamentary elections by imposing a fixed blueprint of a socialist society to be achieved, rather than limiting itself, the constitution, to establishing the rules of the democratic game. So this was the case of Portugal, but Portugal is a small country and doesn't matter much for this discussion. Anyway, this was also the main warning of Ralph Dahrendorf in 1990 about the transition from communism to liberal democracy in Central and Eastern Europe. 25 years ago, shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Ralph Dahrendorf wrote one of the first books that have been published about and in the aftermath of that great event. Great time to be alive, he actually wrote. Reflections on the Revolution in Europe, that was the Burkean title of his book, was a book of joy about the fall of communism, but also a book of caution about the difficulties of transition from communism to liberal democracy. It is certainly no accident that one of the main theses of this book, which reappears at several points of the argument, is that there is a fundamental difference between constitutional and normal politics. Among the various references to this question, I may recall just the following, quote, "Constitutional politics is about the framework of the social order, the social contract, as it were, and its institutional forms. Normal politics is about the directions dictated by interests and other preferences within this framework. Having free and fair elections is a matter of constitutional politics. Campaigning for the privatization of the steel industry is a matter of normal politics. The distinction is not always clear, but this distinction matters. In matters of constitutional politics, there are there are only two ways, the closed or the open society, whereas in normal politics, 100 options may be on offer, and 3 or 4 usually are, or at least 2 usually are." Unquote. Dahrendorf was worried with a then existing tendency in Central and Eastern Europe to replace the closed system of communism with a sort of opposing closed system, so-called pure capitalism, so to speak. Following his intellectual hero, Karl Popper, Dahrendorf insisted that one of the main purposes of a free constitution is to allow an ongoing conversation and competition between rival views on public policy, some more inclined to free markets, for example, others more in favor of state intervention. There was even a more profound reason for Dahrendorf's concern. He was born in Germany in 1929 and had studied carefully the difficulties of 19th and 20th century German political culture in accepting the untidy pluralism, that was Dahrendorf's expression, of Western liberty. In his influential book, Society and Democracy in Germany, published in 1965, Dahrendorf criticized those unfortunate dichotomies in which German thought is rich and of which the contrast between a higher literary culture and a lowly technical civilization is just one example, unquote. These unfortunate dichotomies emerged from and encouraged the view of society as monist and unitary, as opposed to pluralistic entities. Because modern societies are not monist entities, and probably never were, a monist view fosters a dogmatic clash for supremacy between rival monist views. As Karl Popper argued, these monist views then aim at arresting social change and social conflict and at imposing a monist blueprint, a scheme of perfection, as Anthony Quinton and Michael Oakeshott put it. To this clash between different schemes of perfection, Dahrendorf called those unfortunate dichotomies in which German thought is rich. And he always tried to avoid the liberal political straitjackets of unfortunate dichotomies. Well, I think I'm now a bit late, so I will probably skip the passage about the European Union because it's a bit alien to our discussion here. And so let me conclude by briefly restating my argument. I have tried to argue that modern liberty rests on a complex balance between two principles: constitutional government and representative government, or popular government, accountable to Parliament. Tyranny can occur whenever this balance is broken, or, as Edmund Burke would have put it, when the equipoise of the vessel of liberal democracy may be endangered by overloading it upon one side. I have submitted that this overloading upon one side, be it the side of constitutionalism or the side of the will of the people, is mainly associated with the promise or the ambition of a final model of perfection, a perfect society. The common feature of politics of perfection is the ambition to arrest change in order to achieve and maintain a final model of society that is perceived as being perfect. In order to avoid tyranny, we should therefore refuse politics of perfection, and we should prefer politics of imperfection. And it is this politics of imperfection that underpins the modest concept of democracy, which has been associated with liberty. The modest concept of democracy presented namely by Karl Popper, Schumpeter actually presented a similar view, as the regime that cannot guarantee good government, but can certainly guarantee that bad governments can be dismissed without bloodshed. In other words, this modest concept of democracy, we could perhaps call it a negative concept of democracy, does not guarantee any end result to be achieved. It only provides the general rules of a civil and civilized political life, within which change can take place without bloodshed, without violence. It was in this fashion of politics of imperfection, I believe, that Winston Churchill famously said that, quote, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms of government that have been tried from time to time. Thank you.
Ryan Ballard, I'm glad to see that he's here at this conference, is really an historian masquerading as a political scientist. I have been accused of being a political scientist masquerading as an historian. You should all be warned. Back in the third quarter of the last century, of the last millennium, when I first became fascinated by matters political, there was in the Dominican Republic a tyrant named Rafael Trujillo. Of this man, who ruled that country with an iron hand for more than 30 years, it was said that when he returned to his palatial home each evening, he could expect to find upstairs a different dinner and a different woman awaiting him in every bedroom. I do not know whether the story which I've just related is strictly speaking true, though it is clear enough that it really does capture the spirit of the Trujillo dictatorship. It was not for nothing that the tyrant was called by his subjects the goat. And indeed, in response to that, there is a novel by Mario Vargas Llosa called The Feast of the Goat, about the last years of the Trujillo dictatorship. What I can say with confidence is that the lurid tales told concerning Trujillo fit nicely with the account of tyranny provided by Herodotus in his histories and by Plato in the Republic. And they arguably capture the flavor of actual ancient tyranny. Polycrates of Samos, Hipparchus of Athens, and Hero of Siracusa would surely have understood the story's point. I do not disbelieve the ancient 5th century stories told about these tyrants. The ancient tyrants and those in more modern times who resembled them may have been populists, and they may have exploited class tensions. They may have had a certain ambition as well. But they were not idealists armed with programs, and they were anything but averse to enjoying the privileges attendant on one-man rule. The tyrant depicted in Aristotle's Politics rules in the interest of no one apart from himself. Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin, Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler, Mao Zedong and Ho Chi Minh, Fidel Castro and Pol Pot, these men were tyrants of a new and different breed. They were men of ideas. They published books. They pursued elaborate programs. Holding power and enjoying the fruits thereof were no doubt for them a great source of satisfaction, but it did not suffice. They exploited modern technology. They refined the age-old techniques of tyranny, and they forged a marriage between old-fashioned despotism and the visionary idealism and the public spiritedness that animated classical republicanism in ancient Greece and Rome. Like the lawgivers of antiquity, at least as these were imagined by Plato, Xenophon, Aristotle, Polybius, Cicero, Livy, Plutarch, and the like, these distinctively modern tyrants had as their aim the shaping of character and the radical transformation of social relations. They were, in a word, supremely ambitious, and they were certainly unwilling to leave well enough alone. Whence came the impulse typifying and distinguishing the modern tyrant? How should we understand that impulse? Here I suggest we should take as our guide the political philosopher who revolutionized our understanding of the possibilities inherent in one-man rule. What Xenophon, with his subtle, understated dialogue, the hero, did for ancient tyranny, I believe Machiavelli did for modern tyranny in The Prince. To make my case, however, I will have to suggest a highly unorthodox reading of The Prince. So bear with me. I may be very wrong. There is no shortage of scholarly literature on the work that Machiavelli entitled not The Prince, but De Principatibus. I'll come back to that. Almost precisely half a millennium ago. The book was released about 1516. It was being drafted in December 1513. But there is one chapter in that slim volume which has been neglected. It is, in a sense, a hidden chapter. It is not included in the program laid out in the book's opening chapter. It appears as if out of nowhere, and it seems to go nowhere. It seems, in fact, to be a passing afterthought, and it is usually ignored. Political science professors, I hope not at Dartmouth, do not assign this chapter. Scholars rarely acknowledge its existence, and when they do, they generally take it as an occasion in which to dismiss the subject entirely. In his little book on Machiavelli, for example, Quentin Skinner made no mention of the chapter entitled Of Ecclesiastical Principalities. Even more to the point, in the justly celebrated chapter he devoted to Machiavelli in Politics and Vision, Sheldon Wolin read the Florentine as contending that ecclesiastical governments were irrelevant to the proper concerns of his new political science, and as thinking that they were not politic enough to warrant the attention of political thought. I think the precise opposite, that making sense of the ecclesiastical principality is central to Machiavelli's new political science. That the chapter slipped unobtrusively into The Prince as a surprise is crucial to its author's larger purpose. Consider what the Florentine has to say in the pertinent chapter about ecclesiastical principalities. All difficulties regarding them come before they are possessed, because they are acquired either by virtue or by fortune, and are maintained without the one or the other. For they are sustained by orders that have grown old with religion, and which have been so powerful and of such a kind that they keep their princes in the state however they proceed and live. These alone have states and do not defend them. They have subjects and do not govern them. And the states, though ungoverned, do not care, and they neither think of becoming estranged from such princes, nor can they. Thus, only these principalities are secure and prosperous. Only these principalities are secure and prosperous. It is true that Machiavelli goes on to say that these principalities subsist by superior causes to which the human mind does not reach, and that he will omit speaking of them For since they are exalted and maintained by God, it would be the office of a presumptuous and foolhardy man to discourse on them. But there is in this pious disclaimer more than a trace of sarcasm. And after saying, non di manco, which is what Machiavelli always says when he's about to hammer you, he goes on to display with considerable ostentation the presumption and foolhardiness that he purports to eschew. And he does so by boldly discussing what he has just said he's going to omit. For him, I believe, the ecclesiastical polity is the central mystery of modern politics. Above all else, he intimates, it is what would come to be called priestcraft that modern princes, operating in principalities and republics alike, must, if they are to be effective, get their minds around. There's another chapter in which obliquely Machiavelli touches on the same question. I have in mind the central chapter of the first part of The Prince, chapter 6, where he addresses a subject quite near and dear to his own heart, new principalities that are acquired through one's own arms and virtue. It is in this chapter that he makes use of language that he will again deploy in the preface to the first book of his Discourses on Livy to describe his own aims. It is in this chapter that he speaks of new princes as founders who have introduced new orders and modes. Note that phrase. In the Discourses on Livy, it's new modes and orders. And he is the author of new modes and orders. Here, it is new orders and modes. And these princes who have acquired principalities through their own arms and their own virtue have instituted new orders and modes. It is also in this chapter that he playfully and mischievously equates Moses on the one hand with Cyrus, Romulus, and Theseus on the other, treating them as exemplars, all four of them, and singling them out as the new princes and founders who most deserve imitation. It is moreover in this chapter that he speaks of these men in religious language as armed prophets, that he echoes the book of Revelations on the problem posed by lukewarmness, and that in a manner which will attract the admiration of Adolf Hitler, he treats the chief source of this lukewarmness, the incredulity of men who do not truly believe in new things. And he treats this as the central problem faced by new princes who introduce new orders and modes. In short, he's assimilating Moses to Theseus and Romulus and Cyrus. But even more important, he's assimilating Theseus, Romulus, and Cyrus to Moses. Politics is about creed. It is about belief. And you have to figure out how to make people believe. In treating religion under the rubric of political science, that very act, and in speaking of political founders as prophets, Machiavelli ostentatiously follows the lead of the Arab philosopher Al-Farabi and his followers Avicenna and Averroes, whom nobody reads anymore or knows much of anything about, but they're there. They were the first, as far as we can tell, to ponder fully the significance for politics of the emergence of universal, revealed, monotheistic religions, armed with elaborated doctrines, equipped with an organized clergy, and intent on proselytizing all of mankind. He is silent, to be sure, about Muhammad, and he makes no mention of Jesus Christ. But he could be confident that his contemporaries would think about what he left unsaid. After all, from a Renaissance Italian perspective, Muhammad was the armed prophet par excellence, and his followers were still raiding Italy and carrying off slaves in the time of Machiavelli. And one could not speak of Savonarola as an unarmed prophet, as Machiavelli did in this context, without causing those who live within what was then called the Res Publica Christiana to reflect on the manner in which one unmentioned and perhaps in this context, unmentionable prophet, who appears to have been unarmed, managed to establish the only principality in Europe that could be called secure and prosperous. In other words, in the same book, he says, the ecclesiastical principalities, the only principalities that are secure and prosperous. And then he doesn't mention Christ when he's talking about prophets who establish polities. He leaves that for you to do. And he leaves it for you to do because if you think of it yourself, you'll be proud of what you've thought of yourself and you'll believe it. In the opening chapter of the third book of his Discourses on Livy, Machiavelli brings the res publica Christiana as such openly into the picture. There he suggests that religious sects are very much like republics and kingdoms. There he equates religion and politics again. In that, to achieve renewal, they need to be led backward to their beginnings. And he describes the manner in which St. Francis and St. Dominic achieved this. For with poverty and with the example of the life of Christ, they brought back into the minds of men what had already been eliminated there. Their new orders were so powerful that they are the cause that the dishonesty of the prelates and of the heads of the religion do not ruin it. Living still in poverty and having so much credit with peoples in confessions and sermons, they give them to understand that it is evil to say evil of evil, and it is good to live under obedience to them, and if they make an error, to leave them for God to punish. So they do the worst they can, because they do not fear the punishment that they do not see and do not believe. This renewal, therefore, has maintained and does maintain this religion. There is more to this passage than the savage anti-clericalism that one immediately perceives in it, for it savors as well of a grudging admiration, and it also explains how an unarmed prophet could succeed. There are other threads to be pursued in The Prince. As I already mentioned, the title that Machiavelli originally gave this work is De Principatibus, not the Prince, but of principalities. This title is in Latin, and it has as its focus a word that was coined at Rome to describe that polity's rule by an individual who presented himself to the public not as a king or rex, but as a princeps, or first man. A princeps in a res publica, by him restored and renewed. The principatus, established by Augustus Caesar, was the ancient forerunner of modern despotism. It was, to begin with, a tyranny disguised as a republic. Its princeps postured as tribune of the plebs. And as Machiavelli makes clear, it differed in one other crucial respect from the tyrannies that preceded it. In The Prince, as in his Discourses on Livy, Machiavelli asserts that there are two diverse humors that one must take into account, the great ones and the people. And politics is all about siding with the great ones or siding with the people. In the 19th chapter of The Prince, however, he introduces a third humor, the soldiers. Most of those, he tells us, who came to the Principate as new men, once they recognized the difficulty of these two diverse humors, turned to satisfying the soldiers, caring little about injuring the people. That was the option taken by Julius Caesar, and the precedent was followed by Augustus as well. The greatest and most successful of their successors, however, at least in Machiavelli's opinion, would appear to have been Septimius Severus, who possessed, as Machiavelli tells us, so much virtue that by keeping the soldiers his friends, although the people were overburdened by him, he was always able to rule prosperous, because his virtues made him so admirable in the sight of the soldiers and the people that the latter remained somehow astonished and stupefied, and the former were reverent and satisfied. Now, the language that Machiavelli uses in this passage is reminiscent of what he has said earlier in The Prince about the impact on the people of Romagna of Cesare Borgia's sacrifice of Ramiro d'Orco, which left them satisfied and stupefied. And it points forward to the discussion in his Discourses on Livy of those Roman imperatores who sparked a renewal and a return to first principles at Rome by an act of devotio, which is to say, by ostentatiously and publicly sacrificing their own lives. And he comes back to this again and again, and in particular in the same chapter in which he talks about St. Francis and St. Dominic. All of this is clearly pertinent to our understanding of the Christian ecclesiastical principality, which has as its central ritual a reenactment of a human sacrifice intended to leave its adherents not only astonished and stupefied, but reverent and satisfied as well. To be sure, Machiavelli goes on to say that in his time in Europe, where hereditary monarchy is the norm, the soldiers pose less of a problem, and that rulers in Europe should focus on satisfying the people. This would be reassuring, were it not for the fact that in the same paragraph, he also then singles out the Ottoman Turk and Egypt's Sultan as exceptions to the norm, what is the norm in Europe, in their dependence on the soldiers. For at this point, in telling fashion, he compares the Janissary Mamluk regimes, predominant under Sunni Islam, to the Christian pontificate, which cannot be called either a hereditary principality or a new principality. For it is not the sons of the old prince who are their heirs and become lords, but the one who is elected to that rank by those who have the authority for it. And this being an ancient order, one cannot call it a new principality, because some of the difficulties in new principalities are not in it. For the princes indeed knew the orders of that state are old and are ordered to receive him as if he were their hereditary lord. The clergy would appear to be, to the Christian pontificate, what the Janissaries and Mamluks are to the principalities established on something like the Roman model, the Roman imperial model, in Constantinople and Cairo. But there is, of course, this difference. Regarding the polities dominated by a third humor genuinely akin to the Christian clergy, one could say, these alone have states and do not defend them. They have subjects and do not govern them. The states, though ungoverned, do not care, and they neither think of becoming estranged from such princes, nor can they. Thus, only these principalities are secure and prosperous. As we learned in the 1980s, Joseph Stalin, to the contrary notwithstanding, the Pope did have divisions at his beck and call. His soldiers formed an invisible occupying army throughout Europe, and they had mastered the art of controlling men's minds. What then in modern, which is to say in Christian and post-Christian times, could a would-be new prince learn from Machiavelli's ruminations on ecclesiastical principalities? This matter, like many other matters, Old Nick leaves to be pondered by those who will come after. I can only say that in considering this question, I frequently find myself thinking of a remark John Pocock once made to me some years back, that the first fully Machiavellian prince was Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon did not, as John Adams supposed, actually coin the term ideology, but he was among the first to appropriate and deploy it and treat it with disdain as a word specifying the manner in which vulgarized philosophy, Lockeanism, for example, could be made to substitute for religion as the foundation for civil society. And as the Napoleonic Code indicates, Napoleon himself was the very model of a modern, enlightened monarch. As such, he put himself at the head of what Peter Gay would later rightly identify as the party of humanity. In many respects, despite his rejection of the school of thought, he was himself an ideologue. The first to recognize that there was a kinship between the group that Peter Gay described as a party and the practitioners of priestcraft was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And I have a somewhat more positive view of Jean-Jacques Rousseau than Zhao does, but we can talk about that later. With an eye to the project mounted by Denis Diderot and Jean-Laurent d'Alembert when they launched the Encyclopédie, he remarked that prior to the 1750s, Opinions wandered in an incoherent fashion and without regulation at the whim of men's passions, and these passions, constantly banging into one another, caused the public to roam from one place to another in a direction inconstant. Thereafter, however, a profound change took place. A spirit, methodical and consistent, was applied for the purpose of guiding public opinions, and prejudices themselves came to possess a logic of progression and rules all their own. Rousseau had no doubt that he had been present at the creation of something entirely new. This trend, he argued, was among the peculiarities that distinguished the century in which we live from all others. It had its inception when the philosophical sect, note that word, of which he had once been a member, united itself into a body under chiefs. It was underway the moment these chiefs, by the art of intrigue to which they applied themselves, made of themselves the arbiters of public opinion, capable of determining the reputation, even the destiny of particular individuals, and through them, that of the state. And it reached its culmination when they made alliances with powerful men for the purpose of becoming the arbiters of society as such. These chiefs made their newfound allies feel, he wrote, that working in concert they would be able to extend their roots under the feet of men in such a fashion that no one would any longer find solid footing, and no one would be able to march forward except on train that had been countermined. Crucial to all of this was the fact that the chiefs of what Rousseau pointedly described as the philosophical league, modeled on the Catholic League of the 17th century, possess a doctrine all their own, and have mastered the art of making their doctrines circulate in the seminaries and colleges so that the newborn generation is devoted to them from birth. He acknowledged their animosity to the Jesuits, but he insists that this animosity is rooted solely in professional jealousy. And he contends that the philosophes are in fact the great imitators of the mode of proceeding followed by the Jesuits. They govern minds with the same imperial control, with the same dexterity that these others employ in governing consciences. And they are shrewder than these priests in that they know better how to conceal themselves while acting. The Jesuits rendered themselves all-powerful by exercising divine authority over consciences and by making themselves, in God's name, the arbiters of good and evil. The philosophe, not being able to usurp the same authority, applied themselves to its destruction. And then in the course of appearing to explain nature to their docile sectaries, and making of themselves its supreme interpreters, they established in its name an authority no less absolute than that of their enemies, although it appears to be consistent with freedom and to rule over wills solely by way of reason. The struggle between the two parties Rousseau compared to that between Carthage and Rome. These two bodies, he wrote, both imperious, both intolerant, were in consequence incompatible, since the fundamental system of both was to rule despotically. Each wishing to rule alone, they could not share the empire and rule together. Gradually then, and inexorably, the new league, following the erring ways of the other, that is to say, the Catholic League, but with greater adroitness, supplanted it by way of debauching its supporters, and through them brought about its destruction. Now, Rousseau adds, we can see this new league marching along the tracks laid out for it with as much audacity as its predecessor and with much more success, since the other always encountered resistance and this one no longer encounters any. In this fashion, moreover, the philosophe managed, quote, to substitute little by little a philosophical intolerance for the religious intolerance once propagated by the Jesuits. And without anyone perceiving it, they became even more dangerous than their predecessors. The danger posed by this new philosophical league, he thought rooted in the fact that the proud despotism of modern philosophy has carried the egotism associated with the spirit of profound insecurity and fierce vainglory, which Rousseau calls amour propre, to its ultimate extreme. It eventuates in a taste for domination that gives life to all the angry passions related to amour propre. And from among the apprentice philosophes, it produces a generation of despots who, having become slaves in order to be tyrants, exhibit the liveliest intolerance. This intolerance may be more hidden than that once promoted by ambitious and idolatrous priests, but Rousseau insists it is no less cruel. If the new conspiracy does not appear to exercise the same rigor as the old, it is only because it no longer encounters rebels. If, however, there were a renaissance of religious belief, Rousseau writes, if some genuine defenders of theism, of tolerance and morality were once again to present themselves on the public stage, one would soon see raised up against them the most terrible persecutions, for quite soon a philosophical inquisition, more cunning and no less sanguinary than the other, would burn without mercy anyone who dared to believe in God. Now, I quote Rousseau at length for a reason. Even if one thinks his critique of Peter Gay's Party of Humanity excessive, as many do, as an analysis of what was to come in the 20th century, it is penetrating and prescient in the extreme. There would be other tyrants who would follow in Napoleon's wake. Like him, they would govern in the name of an idea. And just as the Christian church in Machiavelli's day had a society for the propagation of the faith that made use of what it in Latin called propaganda, so would Napoleon and his successors make use of this tool. And the latter would improve on his efforts by founding hierarchically organized, ideologically political parties that functioned in the manner of the Christian clergy as an army of occupation, intent above all else on occupying men's minds. There would be this one difference, to be sure. The Napoleonic principality and the new totalitarian principalities constructed in the 20th centuries would have states, and they would defend them. They would possess subjects, and they would govern them. In some, they would combine the functions of Caesar and Christ in one head. They would deploy force and propaganda to powerful effect at the same time. I would like to think that the age of modern tyranny has passed. And 25 years ago, when the Berlin Wall fell, I entertained that very possibilities. I'm not now so sanguine. Modern tyranny's distinctive techniques of governments are still available. They have been refined over the years, and they are apt to be used. Because the fundamental rule of political life is that when temptation is presented, temptation to abuse, temptation to take advantage, most men, most of the time, will succumb to that temptation. We live in an age of ideological partisanship. We live in a time in which partisan proclivities have a quasi-religious edge. We live in a period in which propaganda is deployed to powerful effect. Thanks in part to the emergence of electronic media, the manipulation of public opinion is now a fully developed art. And this is not all. For thanks to advances in computing, thanks to the internet and to the development of drones, we live in an age in which privacy has, for all intents and purposes, disappeared. Governments now have tools of surveillance that Joseph Stalin would envy, and Mao Zedong. Techniques of surveillance that allow them to track our every move and to record our every word. And even in the liberal democracies, governments appear to be intent on doing just that, tracking our every move and recording our every word. Before long, the 20th century tyrannies that we thought of as totalitarian will be outclassed by despotisms with a far greater capacity to exercise total control. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just ask a question of each of you, and also try to leave time for questions from the rest. I'm curious about whether you might follow the suggestion of your foreboding closing note, and just say a little bit more about what would be required for liberal democracy to become tyrannical. And I'm also interested in the same question from your perspective. How close are we, or how far is the distance from the regime that we're familiar with in the West to the regime that we most fear? So you suggest in your closing note that the space is collapsing between the regime we love and the regime we most fear. That's my question. Let me just adorn it a little bit. You both argue that the difference between ancient tyranny and modern tyranny is the difference between a tyranny based on eros, or somehow fueled by unbounded erotic desire, which of course will have a sexual expression, but it's sex for the sake of power, for the sake of displaying your power, not sex for the sake of sexual, just sort of beautiful sex for the sake of sexual pleasure. So it's an unbounded erotic desire to assert, often, of one person, to assert his superiority, almost his exemption from membership in the common species, such that the whole regime exists for the sake of the one, rather than the reverse. And in modern tyranny doesn't have that erotic aspect. It doesn't have one who asserts his superiority over the rest. Or if one does, he has to justify it by a program and a plan. So the modern tyrant is a man with a plan. And the plan gets its persuasive force from the promise of perfection that it offers. And the perfection that it offers is to the many, or to the whole. Really, and when you conjure an image of modern tyranny, what you point to, Professor Espada, is a civil service, a vast tutelary power, as Tocqueville describes it. You ask, well, who peoples this vast tutelary power? Is it one who's really secretly acting out the life of an ancient tyrant, but just masking it with the programmatic language of modern rationalism? Or is it more than one? And I think the idea is that it's more than one. It's an administration, and it's peopled by soulless civil servants who are the Weberian, almost, civil servants, who are notable for their complete lack of eros and pathos. They have no sympathy. They administer rules that get their justification from the way that they serve the interests of the whole. And so the perfection that each side of the balance that you describe, you describe just politics as an equipoise, a middle point between extreme administration and extreme formless populism or democracy. So it's a democracy with a form. It's a democracy with some administration, but not too much. Constitutional democracy. What pulls to the extreme, I take it, is this promise of perfection, as you put it, but perfection always has an egalitarian center. So it's that by going to one extreme or the other, we could more perfectly actualize the promise of equality. But the promise of equality, it's not clear, relies on any kind of erotic desire. And that's what differentiates. It's a promise that the many are persuaded by, but not the one who's driven by an erotic desire to assert his superiority. So modern tyranny seems to be without eros, whereas ancient tyranny had eros. That's my interpretation of your two beautiful learned contributions. And I wonder then how far liberal democracy is from this specter of modern tyranny. I wonder it because liberal democracy seems to have the programmatic and rationalistic character, or it can there's a self-understanding of liberal democracy that makes it very much akin to the 20th century ideologies that Professor Ray Yusei motivated modern tyranny. So your examples of modern tyrants are, on one hand, Napoleon, who's the rationalizing autocrat or dictator, man with a plan. But it's refined in the 20th century with your further examples of Mao, Stalin, Castro, all communists, and Hitler, Mussolini, fascists. So those examples are comforting in a way, as is the Trujillo example, because we could say, well, we don't have that. We don't have this ruthless ideological rule. We have constitutional democracy, but Rousseau's description of the tyranny of the philosophes and and your description of its kinship to the ecclesiastical polity makes me wonder if liberal democracy is so distant from the tyrannies that we fear. Here's a self-understanding of liberalism that's not that strange. Liberalism is based on a rational account of the ends of politics, which are security and prosperity. These are purposes that everybody can agree to, if you follow the logic of Hobbes or Locke. So they're not goods or purposes that describe one particular social group or a particular way of life. And when those purposes are placed at the center of politics, it doesn't represent the ascent of one group over the rest, and therefore the rule of a part over the whole. It represents the ascent of human purposes, purposes that any human being can sign on to, as opposed to particularistic purposes. They're universal. To understand how they're universal, we could rationally apprehend the essence of human nature, which is to see people as naturally free and equal. So liberalism doesn't suppose that it's based in a culturally specific understanding of human beings. Around here, we're just used to parliamentary government. We've been doing it for hundreds and hundreds of years, so it makes sense to us. Who's to say that it might also work in Iraq or Afghanistan? The liberal self-understanding is that it's based in a true apprehension of human nature. And a universal understanding of human nature. And if people are sufficiently illuminated such that they understand the truth about human nature and the truth about the right purposes of politics, and if those people come into power rather than corrupt types who would substitute their own private ends for these universally true ends, then we'd also have a rational administration of politics. So the project for liberal politics is just to keep things from getting too corrupt, and that requires maybe constitutional forms that check individual temptation. So this regime looks like the kind of ideological regime that Rousseau is calling out. It looks like the ecclesiastical polity, and the beauty of it is that it doesn't require violence to reproduce itself. This is what frustrated so many critics of liberalism over the years. I remember the moment when I was an undergraduate reading Herbert Marcuse's, account of repressive tolerance, and he's just making himself crazy with the way that, the American middle class gobbles up criticisms of itself. Yes, we've closed our minds, closing the American mind. Yes, right, that's the problem with us. We have closed minds. And then they carry on living exactly as they had before. Yes, we are soulless materialists, given over to mindless consumption. Yes, we're destroying the planet. And they go on starting their engines and heating their houses in just the same way as they did before. Every criticism of their thing, they accept, but they don't. But it doesn't budge their fundamental conception of them, that their regime is actually the true way of organizing society and politics, and that their way of life isn't distinctive, but it represents the truth about justice and flourishing. And you could go to others like C.B. Macpherson saying, this Lockean thing isn't the universal truth. This is really just this is a particular way of life. It's possessive individualism is the whole truth. Or Marx, who says liberalism, its pretensions to universalism is a lie. We have to refine it. It's really bourgeois morality universalized. The morality of a small class universalized to a whole society. So there are criticisms of liberal democracy, but they're at least in some places, like the United States, relatively ineffective. The beauty of the liberal ideology is that it doesn't require it doesn't require clumsy propaganda. It's like the ecclesiastical polity; it works itself out, and not only that, it even deludes those who rule. So they're not just using it as a mask to justify the indulgence of their, private desires. They believe it too, which is why you get this vast tutelary power filled with, soulless social servants who really believe that, when they are administering the Affordable Care Act, they are serving the party of humanity. And so you, in a different context, I noticed on Ricochet, said that the Affordable Care Act presupposes an administrative state that assumes a power over lives that's nothing less than tyrannical. which makes me think, we are living in a tyranny. We have an administrative state. It's presupposed by the very possibility of passing the Affordable Care Act and implementing it. We have an administrative state that puts us in a tyranny now. So anyway, that makes me, that's just to adorn the question: how far is liberal democracy from tyranny? And I also think of the administration, the civil service in Brussels, dictating every little tiny feature in the, and there's a rational reason for it. We have to, if you're going to trade across many different language-speaking communities and many different polities, you have to have universal standards. And so it's for the sake of prosperity that these bureaucrats have this incredible control over daily life of, what you can call wine and how you can label it. And so a farmer is told by these bureaucrats in Brussels, a farmer with 40 acres of grapes in France is told by, or Portugal, told by bureaucrats in Brussels, to the minute detail what they can call the thing that they're selling. So is this the tyranny we fear, or is that really a distorted description of the regime we inhabit? So finally, I'll just say, I'm given to understanding liberal democracy not as a programmatic regime based in a rational apprehension of the truth about human nature and the truth about human purposes, but as something much more like Aristotle's conception of a mixed regime that mixes democracy and oligarchy, mixes a democratic element and an oligarchic element, and ideally, if it's really working, if it's really firing on all cylinders, also an aristocratic element, that somehow from that mixture of democracy and oligarchy produces something better than either alone can produce on its own. And the mixture is so exquisite that nobody in the regime perceives it as a mixture. Although, you see the mixture at work in debates about the tax code, where those with a lot of property and those without will actually support radically different policies. And you might see it in the more intensified partisan combat of the moment in American politics. Nonetheless, people generally think of themselves as living out a common way of life. That's to say that's marked more by its commonalities than by its differences, even if there are vast differences of wealth. And so that the task of securing it against becoming a tyranny is to preserve the mixture, to actually remember that it's not a programmatic politics based on the perfect exercise of reason, but it's really, it's an imperfect politics based on an accommodation to natural sources of power, neither of which are all that just, but neither of which can be dispensed with without an inhumane degree of violence. I'll stop. If you have a few words, do you want to offer a few words now before we turn to questions? Or want to take a couple of questions, let them pile up a bit?
Because time is.
Yes. Anyone else want to toss in a thought or question? Yeah.
Very interested in references to Tocqueville and Rousseau, and one of my favorites, political theorist, someone who I think is one of the most underappreciated intellectuals of the 20th century, is Bertrand de Juvenal. And he wrote a political trilogy, Power, which I think is a sequel to Tocqueville's Democracy in America. And then his second book, Sovereignty, and the Third Pure Theory of Politics. And in the second volume on sovereignty, he raises a question of, and he says point blank, the problem of modernity is the definition of sovereignty. And one wonders if one way to maybe save or reform a liberal democracy is to do away with the modern notion of popular sovereignty. And I say this thinking back, if you read The Federalist, for example, Madison had a partible view of sovereignty. That he nowhere is it ever defined in The Federalist, but the idea of partible sovereignty is a medieval conception. It was jurisdictional. Justice Joseph Story talks about the confusion about the idea of sovereignty in his commentaries. And he draws a sharp distinction between two kinds of sovereignty. The one which says that sovereignty really means the idea of superiority within your jurisdiction. And of course, Juvenal, following Tocqueville, makes a great deal of this around the idea of make-weights, of mediating associations, of having mixture, having a balance. The modern idea of sovereignty, which of course Blackstone expressed and others, is this idea that there must be some sort of absolute or final judge. And of course, needless to say, many of the political athletes who have become tyrannical have used this very effectively to concentrate power. The image that Juvenal, of course, gave us to the modern state is the Minotaur. Half man, half beast. The enforcer, but also, the satisfier of appetites. It has a human face. So I'm wondering if anyone on the panel could discuss the question of sovereignty. After all, that question caused the greatest event in our national history, the Civil War. One could argue that that was centrally about sovereignty, its meaning and its locus. Is not the problem of modernity the problem of defining popular sovereignty as this kind of last final arbiter, when we better serve by hearkening back to a medieval understanding?
Here's one example that would reinforce your point. If you go through Montesquieu looking for the word sovereignty, you'll find that he dodges it at every opportunity. And someone who lived in France under Louis XIV and after would be nervous about sovereignty, as he was. And the separation of powers is a way of muting what we would call sovereignty. As long as I'm here, let me say a word about what you said. I used to think, and I still think, that soft despotism, the sort of gradual drift into the control of a soulless bureaucracy, was the great danger. And I think it is a great danger. But in the last few years, I've come to think that the capacity for surveillance has altered the playing field politically. Which is to say, the more malicious, cruel use of the techniques of control, that's very likely to happen. Mm-hmm. It'll happen in China, for example, where they desperately want to control every little thing, and they're terribly afraid of upheaval. My guess is Putin's Russia will take this new technology and put it to very effective use. The technology is being put to use here. I mean, every new car is going to have a tracking device, it looks like. And every telephone call is recorded, and every email is recorded. And computer programs can search telephone calls and emails. All of this is in the name of security, but all of it concentrates power in hands that we trust with this power. Well, the question is, how trustworthy are human beings who hold power? What is the, what does history have to teach us about that? And I think the answer is there are some individuals who are beyond temptation, who do not succumb. But that's not the norm. And over time, people will succumb. Let me take one example, and then I'll stop. The trajectory of the Soviet tyranny is very interesting. Idealist in the beginning, but in the last years of Brezhnev, it was like a mafia regime. And it resembled Trujillo at the local level, with local potentates in control of various places or various organizations, exercising power in exactly the way that Trujillo had exercised power. In other words, the idealism that animates these totalitarian regimes has a way of breaking down over the generations. And these regimes place people in positions where they are, to come back to that word in Herodotus, Book 3, paragraph 80, about accountability, the without euthuna. And in the Soviet regime, no one had a Euthuma, basically, who was in a position of responsibility, unless somebody higher up got word of it, but that could be prevented. So the consequence is you get the worst sort of corruption along the lines of that which is attributed to the ancient tyrants. And perhaps Pisistratus in ancient Athens was not corrupt in this way, but his son Hipparchus clearly was. So when you move from the generation that founds one of these tyrannies to the next generation, from Cypselus to Periander, from Pisistratus to Hipparchus, unless you throw out all the evidence, you get this same kind of abuse. But your paper's really on the subject.
Yeah, may I say a couple of
Yes,
very
please.
briefly, a couple of points? Well, first of all, I mostly agree, I entirely agree with your comments, and I think I'd like to emphasize the fact that there is a basic agreement between our two views, I think, with the possible exception of Rousseau, to whom I will come back in a minute. Yes, and I mean, you have presented this at the very beginning, that these were modern tyrants were tyrants of a different breed. They were men of ideas. They pursued programs. These modern tyrants had as their aim the shaping of character and the transformation of social relations. So they were, in a word, supremely ambitious. I think that's crucial to understand the problem of modern tyranny. Now, you mentioned liberalism. I now rarely use the expression liberalism because it gets a bit ambiguous. So I prefer to use the expression tradition of liberty, which is a global attitude that may comprise different currents, including some forms of liberalism, some forms of conservatism, and things like that. So, but the main point of this attitude, I think, is limited government, and that's what I was trying to say. The main difference between the Anglo-American tradition and the continental and French tradition is that the question of limited government is at the core of the Anglo-American tradition, where it is not at the core of the continental tradition. How close are we in our liberal democracies to a new form of tyranny? That's the crucial question you raised. And well, I don't know, but I think that the source of the threat of new form of tyranny in our liberal democracies comes always from the idea, the abandonment of the idea of limited government. And in this sense, I just would like to read two passages, and with this I will conclude, from James Madison, Federalist 51, compared with Rousseau, The Social Contract. So, I mean, you all know the passage by Madison: if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern man, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by man over man, the great difficulty lies in this: you must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place oblige it to control itself. And then this crucial passage: a dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control on the government, but experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions. Okay, so now Rousseau, from The Social Contract. Now, as the sovereign is formed entirely of the individuals who compose it, it has not, nor could it have, any interest contrary to theirs. And so the sovereign has no need to give guarantees to the subjects, because it is impossible for a body to wish to hurt all of its members. And, as we shall see, it cannot hurt any particular member. And then this terrifying sentence: the sovereign, by the mere fact that it is always all that it ought to be, unquote. So I think these two passages show a huge contrast, huge opposition of two understandings of, well, you could call it self-government. It's basically self-government in both cases, but the understanding of self-government is completely different. I would submit that administrative state that you mentioned is a great threat, and in our liberal democracies, it is being promoted by this Rousseauian faith in the government of all equals gathered together. If government comes from government of equals and of all gathered together, then the threat of despotism that you associate with government by one or by the few no longer exists. That's the continental view. I think the Anglo-American view is that it doesn't matter whether it's one or the few or all gathered together. The crucial point is to limit government, limit power.
Right.
Okay.
There's something worth tossing in at this. As Bertrand Juvenal pointed out at some length, what Rousseau says about the sovereign is not being said about the government. And if you look at the rest of the social contract, Rousseau looks a lot like a Whig. Very great distrust of those who are in positions of responsibility, such as the administrative state, but also who hold magistracies, and all sorts of checks to prevent abuse of power by those people. The other thing is, Rousseau rejects representative government. So Congress is not speaking for the people. It can't, according to Rousseau. So he would be just as suspicious of elected representatives. The regime that he imagines and the sovereign actually meets and acts as a sovereign. So he's thinking something like the ancient Greek city, ancient Athens, or now, could that go very wrong? Yes, I agree with you. But it's very useful to realize just the degree to which he has absorbed the English Whig tradition with its suspicion of the abuse of power on the part of those who are entrusted with authority. And his argument is the only people you can trust are the people. Now, whether you can trust them, that's a whole other question.
Yeah. But the Federalists, they said, dependence on the people is no doubt primary control, but experience has taught mankind that even dependence on the people is not enough. And for Rousseau, if the sovereign is the people, then everything is fine, provided that the sovereign is the people.
Sometimes I describe Rousseau as a Madisonian.
Oh,
Rousseau,
do you?
because Rousseau says sovereignty can't be represented.
Right.
And Madison, popular sovereignty was very crucial to the Federalists in the United States in the late 1780s because it allowed them to explain the persistence of two layers of government. And they could say the people are the sovereigns. Neither the state government nor the central government is sovereign. The people are the sovereigns, and they're delegating some of their sovereign power to one layer and some sovereign power to another layer. I read that in a 1,000-page book that I covered one day. And
James Wilson,
and
who is the only
Yeah.
American founder who really does look to Rousseau.
yeah.
And he said that kicking the can down the road because the Constitution was vague.
Yeah.
That was the easy way out.
Yeah.
The tougher question, how you institutionalize it.
Yeah.
So, the people are sovereign, we'll solve it later.
Well, alas, we'll have to work out Rousseau's Madisonian affinities over lunch because it's time to eat. It's time to break. Thank you for these superb papers and presentations and for coming. We're just it's very illuminating and we're very delighted to have you here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.